What we're going to talk about now is the challenge of sustainable supply chain management that concerns the sourcing side. We're going to draw on material from our recent book, Purchasing and Supply Chain Management, a Sustainability Challenge. We're going to look at a number of different models and concepts that concerns sourcing in the traditional sense, but we're also going to look at strategic sourcing and sustainable sourcing. So specifically what we want to do is to explore the meaning of sourcing, strategic sourcing. Again, there are lots of different definitions and viewpoints upon what these terms mean. So what we will do here is really to provide a brief introduction to these concepts. We'll also introduce a strategic sourcing process model, and then we'll briefly touch on the need for a company to have different suppliers of different levels of importance to the company. As a point of departure, what we want to start with is a rather long definition. I'm not going to read the whole thing out here, but we're going to look at a long definition of sustainable purchasing. This is a definition that my colleague Joe Miemczek and I have developed with a colleague that defines sustainable purchasing in terms of considering environmental, social, ethical and economic issues in the way in which the company or an organization manages its external resources, so that it benefits not just the company itself, but also society and the economy as a whole. Now, sourcing should be seen really in relation to purchasing and supply chain management. What we can say is that sourcing concerns the front end of the purchasing process, in particular the part that concerns finding suppliers and selecting suppliers. When we talk about strategic sourcing, then we focus not just on finding and selecting suppliers, but really also the long-term considerations that are about building up and developing a sustainable supply base. And when we talk about sustainable sourcing, what we do there is that we focus on the economic, environmental and social issues in the sourcing process. This is a model that we use to illustrate the strategic sourcing process. The background for this is that sourcing in itself suggests that when a company chooses a supplier, when it goes out to find a supplier, then it starts from scratch. And very few companies actually do that. What they do is that they spend a lot of time subjecting suppliers to a rigorous selection process where they explore potential supply options, they select them so that they become parts of their list of approved suppliers, and then through this process they build up a base, a supply base of the suppliers that they have as preferred suppliers. These are the suppliers that they will always prefer to reuse when they buy something. So we have listed here a number of activities concerning pre-selection, selection, and then some of the activities that companies engage in when they try to develop and maintain an ongoing supply base. So these are, for example, ongoing supplier evaluation and audits. Now, from a sustainability point of view, these are important because companies need to monitor, they need to constantly evaluate practices and processes within their suppliers. But when they find that suppliers don't perform according to their expectations, if they find that suppliers don't comply with their standards or regulations, then what companies increasingly do, instead of just finding another supplier, is that they will choose to put resources into developing the skills and competencies of these suppliers. So there's a constant circle here of evaluating, auditing suppliers, developing these suppliers, and ongoing relationship management of the suppliers. This suggests also a hierarchy of different kinds of suppliers, where some are essentially potential suppliers. These are the suppliers that they might use when they buy something, but really they prefer by far to use those suppliers that they have approved through their selection and evaluation process. And ultimately they really prefer to deal with those suppliers that they classify as their preferred suppliers. They're those suppliers that present the lowest risk. As this diagram here shows, companies put more and more resources, more and more investment as we go up into this hierarchy of different kinds of suppliers. Companies use traditionally a number of different criteria when they identify and select their suppliers. So these might be technical requirements concerning the nature of the product. These could be commercial requirements. Of course, these are about prices, but it could also be about, for example, terms and conditions. These are supply chain requirements in terms of logistical, transport requirements, for example, delivery issues. So, for example, it's important to specify if a supplier needs to supply on a just-in-time basis. These are service requirements, so the services, for example, after sales or maintenance services that suppliers are expected to deliver. Also, there are requirements to do with research and development and innovation. So, for example, a company will expect a supplier to have certain technological standards and competencies so that they can contribute to new innovations, new developments of new products. But increasingly, and from a sustainability perspective, it's also very important to consider criteria that have to do with the environment. So, for example, customers will want to evaluate environmental criteria that have to do with pollution and compliance with what's called the ISO 14000 standards. Now, ISO is the international standard organization that issue many different standards, and the 14000 standards particularly address environmental issues. And also it's important as part of the sourcing process, as part of the sourcing criteria, to evaluate social issues. So these might be employee conditions, issues to do with child or slave labor, supply companies paying their employees no less than the minimum wage, and so forth. Often these are captured also through, as minimum standards, the ISO 26000. So this is a quick introduction to sustainable sourcing. If we can summarize, sourcing concerns the front end of the purchasing process, particularly about finding and selecting suppliers. But as we've briefly explained here, few companies these days source from suppliers that they have little experience with. Therefore, the focus, particularly when we talk about strategic sourcing process, it's about building up a long-term, stable and sustainable supply base. And we briefly talked about sustainable sourcing here, which then implies that along with a range of other criteria that companies traditionally look at when they source from suppliers, they also include environmental criteria, social criteria, as well as the economic criteria.